Just going to keep rolling straight into the next presentation. So it is an absolute pleasure to welcome Ben Medley up to the stand. Ben is a rescue swimmer and intensive care paramedic from Australia. Following his passion in the field of helicopter rescue, Ben's completed a doctorate into what it takes to the standards required to be a helicopter rescue swimmer. Now, despite the fact that it is a study at a doctorate level, he has used some very unique Hollywood movies to dumb it down to the rescue swimmer level for us all to understand. So I look forward to seeing this presentation, and welcome Ben Medley.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks everyone for having me. And it follows on nicely from Pedro's work, hopefully, this presentation. And we'll have a bit of a talk more about the physiological capacity of the job that you do as rescue swimmers. This is in the context of the service that I work for, which I'll give you a brief introduction to. This study ran over a couple of years, just before COVID and into the first start of COVID. So I've been a paramedic for 24 years and working on a HEMS role for the last 14 of those, and with about 20 years in research and academia. And my undergraduate degree was in exercise physiology, so that's where my interest in this area lies. And we've been lucky to publish around the world in a range of journals on the job that you do, which is an incredibly challenging job, as you all very much appreciate. And Mario alluded to how harder it gets as the time ticks on. So the service that I work for is a different service to what most of you work for. We're a state-based funded ambulance service that has a multi-role HEMS and SAR aircraft. We have 45 staff across 4 bases. And all paramedics in Australasia, so Australia, New Zealand and the UK as well, have a bachelor's degree to become a paramedic. And then for those who work on the aircraft, it's a master's or a postgraduate diploma to go on and work on the aircraft. And our population is very different because all of the people who work on the aircraft have to have been a road-based or ground-based paramedic for at least 10 years before they work on the helicopter. So you really don't see people starting in the role until they're early to mid-30s. So that makes for a different group of people to select and assess for the role. The state we work across is big, not in the context of the rest of Australia. It's one of the smaller states in Australia, but it's still quite big. And you can see some comparisons to some of your own areas on the right-hand side, or your right-hand side there. We have a population of 6.7 million. More than 5 million of those live in the city, in the one city of Melbourne, and the rest are just scattered around the state. So we do a lot of wilderness type work, and we've got a very large amount of coastline as well. We have 6 AW139s across the state, 5 in operation and 1 as a redundancy aircraft at any one time. And our work mix, as I said, is very different to the work that most people here would do. Probably only 10% of our work is SAR, and the rest is medical retrieval, going out to small regional hospitals and bringing very sick patients into the major metropolitan hospitals. And then 50% of our work is roadside response, car crashes, men doing stupid stuff. So we all know what that's about. So my project started basically because I got involved when I was an undergraduate student with the selection of a group of paramedics for the helicopter way back. And they were kind of experimenting with what are the things that paramedics working in these multi-role HEMS SAR positions, what do we need them to do? And they couldn't really work it out. Do we put them on a bike test? Do we put them in the pool? Do we put them on a treadmill? We're not really sure. Do we need to get them to do some deadlifts? Who knows? And it's a bit of a complex problem. And I started to get involved with that process way back then, and then as I became a paramedic, a bit more involved along the way. And as I said, we've got a complex situation because we could have the situation of a car crash on the roadside on any given day, followed by a very complex inter-hospital retrieval, a backcountry, there's snow in Australia, believe it or not, very small amounts in a very small area, but we do a reasonable amount of backcountry rescues. And then of course we've got this coastline, so we find ourselves out in the water rescue environment. Less so than most people here, but still we have to maintain that capacity for all of our staff. Now, of course, it's great, and we all have a lot of what we would say arbitrary or opinion-based ideas of what physical capacity we want our staff to have. But without the data, I've kind of evolved this statement a little bit based on some other people who've got this opinion. Without actually having some data, it's just an opinion, and we really need to provide some evidence to say you must have these qualities to work in this role. So please keep in mind, this study was all performed in my service and may not be applicable to the work that you do in your service, but in general, we find ourselves largely doing a similar role. So we ask our specialist HEMS and SAR teams to perform very physically demanding tasks. We've got a good general idea of that. We have an idea, it's a hard job. But we apply often very generic assessments, so a standard kind of sit-up test or a step test or a bike test. And are they actually related to the job that somebody is doing? So PES, or Physical Employment Standards, is the science that can actually give you the answers. So you do an analysis of what the job is, and then you match your assessments to make sure that your staff can do those jobs. Often they are arbitrary and kind of made up because someone thought you should walk up a hill and that's a good idea, but they may actually not bear any relationship to the tasks. So a couple of case studies. So I asked you to do some homework if you saw the Facebook post. And you should know this guy. He's a guy named Angelo Pappas. He's about 55. He's a senior special agent for the FBI. He likes meatballs, comics, bit of sarcasm. We don't know what his past medical history is though, but hopefully this video is going to work with sound. If we have a look here. There we go. See if you can work out what I'm getting at from this video. Hopefully you got an idea of what I'm getting at. He's got a good point, hasn't he? He's out there eating his meatballs on the side of the road, shooting at bad guys. Why is he diving down the bottom of a pool? Well, everyone here should dive down the bottom of the pool, get the bricks, but should he have to do it? So is the assessment matched to the task that he's required to perform? And you could make an argument that it's not, and even he acknowledges that. All right, what about our friend Johnny Utah? So Utah's pretty bit of a hotshot. He's about 25, he's an FBI special agent, he likes football, he likes surfing, he likes girls, but we know he's got a severe knee injury. And he's an FBI agent. And how do we know he's got a severe knee injury? And if you were Johnny Utah's employer, what would you think about this situation? Pause there for a second. So you're the FBI, you're working selection, you're going, we're going to find our best staff to chase bad guys. Any medical history? Yeah, I folded my knee in half. Okay, no worries, that's all right. Go out there, do your job, mate, see what happens. Okay, so who didn't see that coming? Because if he had gone through a proper selection process, if we'd analysed the tasks that Johnny Utah was required to do, if we'd identified the problems he may have in performing his tasks, then Patrick Swayze wouldn't have got away. So we need to make sure that we're analysing the tasks people are required to do, and we match our people to the role. Do we match the assessment to the task? Really importantly, we must not eliminate those who can do the job from a legal standpoint, but importantly for the individual, for the patients that we serve and the people that we rescue, we should not include people in the role that cannot do the job. And as difficult as that is, especially in the modern era to confront, these are the facts. We must prepare our people and we must identify them, and we must do this in a way that's defensible as well, because this is in the interest of the individual and our patients or our rescuees. And we need to keep our people safe as well. We shouldn't be sending them out into harm's way inadequately prepared. So this study is a long burn. It took a long time to do. And the scientific method behind it is well proven. But we started off by going around all of these various helicopter rescue services that deploy rescue swimmers and land-based rescue people. And we had a bit of an ask of all of these various services, what assessments do you do? So you don't need to break down the detail too much, but it wouldn't be a surprise to anyone in the room that there's a hodgepodge or a mix, sorry, some of my Australian, does that make sense, anyone? Hodgepodge? A mix of various assessments for various different people who might work in a HEMSAR role. And none of them really kind of were consistent across the board. You can see some people are doing some planks, some push-ups. VO2 I'm going to talk about a bit. VO2 max refers to your maximum oxygen carrying or using capacity, sorry. And that's your maximal testing. Often most people will do like a sub-maximal version of that test that predicts your maximal capacity. But you see it's a bit all over the place. Interestingly, in Australasia, a lot of the doctors and medical staff, some go down the wire, some don't. And some have their physical activity or capabilities assessed and some don't. It's all a bit all over the place. But there's some great scientists out of the UK primarily down at the University of Portsmouth who are experts at assessing people for these special roles. And they have developed this process, the Physical Employment Standard, where you find out what the task is, find out the best way to do it, agree what the minimum level of capability or the minimum level of performance is, work out the maximum load that the people are undertaking, work out if that's reasonable, and then build the standard that needs to be met, which then informs your selection process. So a lot of tables and stuff coming up. You don't need to drill into them. I'll just talk about the results. But what we wanted to do first was find out, well, what do you do? What are you actually doing for a job as a bunch of paramedics working in a multi-role service? So we got 15 of these people together. You see the mean age there of 47. We have an older workforce, I won't say old, older workforce where we work, and they had a lot of experience. They'd been doing this job for a long time. And then we took 4 years worth of all of our winch rescue cases for land and water, and we presented that to this group over about 4 hours, and we asked them to start discussing what they thought they did for a job. Because if you go to the pub tonight, have a couple of beers, go, what do you do for a job? It's like, fly out in the middle of the ocean, rescue 40 people, swim 8 kilometres, come back, have 3 more beers, go home, and have some medals and some tea. So those stories sound about right, Mario. There we go, he's got a nod from the audience. So those stories may not be represented in the data. So of course we show them the data, and what we kind of broke it down into different levels. We don't have a second rescue person, it's only a single paramedic in the back of the helicopter. So this chart here speaks to the various loads that our staff had recorded on their debrief sheet after completing their winches. And we see here, you really only need to focus on one area, and that is, if they got winched down onto the ground, an individual, ICFP means intensive care flight paramedic. So if they got winched down onto the ground and there was no one else on the ground to help them, and they'd taken the full complement of the gear that we carry, which is about 43 and a bit kilos, which is a little, probably too much, and they had to then also walk greater than 500 metres or carry a heavy patient, how many times did that happen in 4 years? 0. What happened more commonly was they got winched to the ground. There was somebody else down there, so the friend of the person who's fallen off their motorbike or whatever it might be, and then they had to share the load to walk back to the patient or whatever it is, and that happened a few times, about 5% of the time. So you then have to say, well, what should we assess them to? If that level 3, criterion 3 never happened, should you still expect your staff to actually do that? And when this group discussed that, they said yes, they should. They should be able to do it. Even though it's not in the data, it might happen tomorrow, and it might have happened the day before this data collection period commenced. And of course, everyone's got a war story to say when they did it. So that was what was really important about getting people just to talk about their experiences, and we wrote them all down. We did the same thing for the water rescues, and you'll see in that period, this shows the workload. We only had, however many that is, water rescues in that period of time. So we don't do many of them in our service. But the hardest perceivable rescue that we kind of found in that data was wearing the earth suit, immersion suit. Do you like that? Thanks, Ben. And then swimming to a patient about 50 metres or so, or rescuing more than three or more patients. So that happened a couple of times. We had a couple of big rescues in that period, a couple of isolated big rescues where the staff, and we don't disconnect from the hook, and we had a couple of disconnections where they just had to swim into a cave type job that happened during this period. So we had some interesting cases. And so again, what we said to them was come up with some generic descriptions of what these people need to do. So even though there were some harder tasks, they got pretty conservative and they said, we reckon you should be able to, in the water, swim about 50 metres or so in your gear, get a patient out of the life raft, move back to a safe location to winch, and do it one more time. So even though there was a couple of 3-person rescues, they said, let's just water it down a little bit and be reasonably conservative what about we expect. And I was expecting this room full of, alpha males to upscale everything. They chilled a bit. They were pretty good. For the land, we've got a lot of very remote wilderness in our state, and there's been some long walks into patients where it's unsafe to directly winch. And I thought, they'd be asking people to walk a long way, but they landed on about getting winch down, reconfigure your gear, and then walk about 250 metres and then provide some clinical care at the end. Again, fairly conservative. These are not unreasonable things to ask people to do. We also did another study where we had a good look at their body fat percentage, their weight, and we drilled right down into some other things a little bit later that I'll show you over here. We found they were pretty good for their age. You don't need to, again, read all the data, but you see the mean age of the group that we assessed ranging from 34 to 55. We've got quite a few mid-50s and even some early 60s staff working in our system. We also had this team, I've got a lot of projects going on at this particular time. They wore a Fitbit for a year. We tracked 365 days of minute-by-minute Fitbit data for all their physical activity. And we saw that this group down here, moderate to vigorous physical activity, is the hardest physical activity. It's the HIIT training, it's the high-intensity stuff we all know is important to maintain fitness. The international recommendations are about 150 minutes per week, and this group was doing about 455 on average. So they're a group of people who are active. They're a group of people who all of their cholesterol, their insulin, their blood pressure, all pretty much fall within normal limits, which is surprising. You think by this age they start to get a little bit, a little bit unhealthy, but they looked pretty good overall. Interestingly, this number here, VO2 peak, which we assessed on a treadmill, is your maximum oxygen carrying capacity. It's the 100% gold standard for measuring cardiovascular fitness. About 47, that's pretty good, and is not elite, but for the age group, again, was pretty good. But we wanted to see if, when we assess someone on a treadmill, is that got anything to do with their fitness in the water? And this is what I think some of you can potentially take away and you can discuss at a later time. We wanted to find out if we want to do one of these complicated scientific tests of putting people in the water to assess their maximum oxygen capacity, maximum heart rate, maximum blood lactate levels. We want to put them in the water to do this test. It's complicated. The machinery, all the rest of it is expensive and doesn't like water. So we had to design a protocol. We went to the Australian Institute of Sport, who've got multiple, Olympic gold medals out of that system. They have a test, but it requires the staff to do a 1 kilometre warm-up. The athletes to do a 1 kilometre warm-up, followed by a 2 kilometre protocol. Now we've got a group of mean age of 44 non-elite swimmers. That protocol would see them fatigued by the end of the warm-up. So we had to do a slightly compressed version. So we rang the Institute of Sport. They were amazing. They worked with us to develop this protocol. Protocol was 300 metres, and then we asked them to use a scale called the rating of perceived exertion, which kind of crazily goes from 6 to 20, because it's supposed to match your heart rate to that scale. So 60 is easy, 20 is 200 beats a minute, that's the idea. And we asked them to go to about 15 to start with for that first 300 metres. And then we assessed an expired gas sample. We took their blood lactate levels and we assessed their heart rate continuously. We gave them 2 minutes rest whilst we did those samples, and then we asked them to do 200 metres and we upped it by another couple of points on that rate of perceiving exertion scale to make it pretty hard. And then we repeated those assessments on the 2 minute break, and then as a 100 metre flat out sprint, and for the last 50 metres they swum with a diving rebreather helmet and mask that we modified. And this allowed us to capture their expired air in real time for that last 50 metres. And this is the gold standard to actually measure their effort. And you'll see, actually, Ben came along on this particular day and managed to capture. You see this particular paramedic is at the end of the protocol while we capture their air in the bag here for a later analysis. And you see the level of fatigue he's at by the end of that. He's moving very slowly with a heavy rebreather mask. A very hard test, especially that last 100 metres. Now, lots of numbers here. Don't worry about the numbers so much. Worry about the line on the graph. All of the paramedics went and ran on a treadmill and did a VO2 max test. All of the paramedics went in the pool and did our new protocol, and we wanted to see whether or not there was any relationship between the two. That dotted line would be considered a perfect relationship between the two, and what we achieved was the black line here. So about a 6% difference overall between what we saw on the treadmill and what we saw in the pool. So our conclusion from this study is, if you want to assess the pure physiological component of this, just put them on a treadmill. You don't need to put them in the pool to assess the VO2 max in particular, the lactate. You'll get the same response on a treadmill as you will in the pool. Now, that doesn't replace the need to assess for swimming technical capacity and your rescue capacity. So it doesn't eliminate your ability. You could still got to see them swim in a dry suit, and you've got to make sure they can get someone out of a life raft, and you've got to make sure that they're technically proficient, but from a fitness point of view, chuck them on a treadmill, get the same result, especially in this age group of people. Next study we had to do. Okay, no worries. You've got to swim and you've got to run. You've got to swim and you're going to hike. We're going to ask you to do that. Well, that's fine. What's the minimum time frame? What's your cutoff? At what point do you say you're in, and what point do you say you're out? So me, yesterday, I'm out. I'm over 12 minutes. Gone. Lose my job, pack my bags, go home. But we have to determine scientifically what the standard is. And we used a method called the bookmark method. So we went out, and those tasks from that group at the start, where those paramedics described the generic tasks, we went out and filmed the tasks. So here we've got one of our paramedics performing the 250 metres, walking up uneven terrain with the 43 kilos of gear. You may recognise that, Mario. And as they walk up the hill, we filmed them from 3 different angles. And we did the same thing for that swim-based task as well. So the swim-based task was swim 50 metres to a life raft, remove somebody from the life raft, and then back kick to a safe place to theoretically be winched. Now, performing physiological assessments in real-time helicopter operations was not amenable to Ambulance Victoria, so we had to simulate all of this stuff. Very expensive way to do science, flying around burning fuel for hours. So we took all of those videos and we filmed each of those paramedics doing those tasks 3 different times and we asked them to do it at 3 different paces. We took all of those videos and we digitally changed them. So now we have 9 videos of increasing, or you see from the bottom here, from 1 to 9, of decreasing speed. Then we put all those people back in a room again and we make them have an argument on what they think the minimum standard is. And we just let them battle it out. So they have to sit there and they've got to watch the water videos, all 9 of them, in order. And they've got to sit there and have a coffee in between and then watch the videos for the land task. Now, we did this a couple of different ways. We took one group, sat them in a room, and during coronavirus, we just sent a different group some USB sticks and told them to do it at home. We just kind of thought it as a bit of added science there that we might see what the differences were. Now, when we got them to do it online, we said, we need you to vote for the minimum standard that you would accept that task performed at. And we wanted 80% agreement. So we'll let 20% of people disagree, but we wanted 80% of the people to say, pick a video. So that's why it's called the bookmark method. You put a bookmark at the standard you think that it should be at. Now, when we asked them to do it online, so send them the USB stick at home, they reached 80% agreement for the land-based task after 2 rounds, but they could not get 80% agreement for the swim-based task. Remember, we would do 10 land-based rescue missions for every 1 water-based mission. So the group is collectively inexperienced at the water-based rescue when compared to the land-based rescue. So they made a quick decision on the land, but they couldn't agree on the water. But when we sat them in a room together, they got 80% consensus straight up. The whole group, 80% consensus. So it was when we let them argue, it works better. But effectively, that translated to 80% agreement for both those tasks, and it doesn't really matter too much, but the time was for this face-to-face group when they all sat in a room, video 4 for the land and video number 3 for the water task. And the correlating time is then the minimum standard for that task. And then finally, this is the last part of the study, we wanted to work out, whilst the paramedics were performing those tasks that we'd identified along the way, what was their actual physiological strain. So what percentage of their maximum capacity are you working at when you're doing these tasks? So we made them walk up that hill again, but we captured their gas as they walked up the hill. We made them do the rescue in the water again, and we swam next to them, me, Ben, a couple of other research assistants in the middle of winter in Australia, which is not comparable to anyone else's winter here, so I won't complain. But we did do it in immersion suits. So as we were swimming next to the paramedic doing the rescue task, we literally put the snorkel in their mouth and captured the air and swum next to them with this big bag to capture the data. Some crazy scientific graphs here, but very quickly, we had measured their maximum capacity on the treadmill, we'd measured their maximum capacity in the water, and when they were doing the actual rescue, for the swim task, about 80% of their maximum capacity for that time. And we see here, this is the fun of statistics, some of our people were working at 110% of their max capacity in those tasks, which must be factored in. So statistics are a pain because they just go, well, at the average, everyone's fine. But these two people, this person at 98% of their max and this person at 110% of their max, we need to maybe go and have a chat about what their training program looks like. And of course, the elite athletes you've got in your population down the other end are doing it standing on their head, easy. When we look at their heart rate was pushing up around the 160s to the right up towards 200. And blood lactate here is an interesting one for those who are interested. But blood lactate is a marker of anaerobic metabolism, so making energy without oxygen. And we saw for our swim task about 8 or so, 8 millimoles per litre. A normal blood lactate would be 1.5 to 2. So it's pretty high load. And for the land-based task, pushing up to 12, these are fairly high numbers showing high physiological strain. We're able to calculate one other thing from this, and it's a thing called MAUD, or maximum acceptable work duration. So you take all of the heart rate and the oxygen data, put into a calculation, and we can determine in a time frame, based on that physiological strain, how long it's safe to do that task before you will be unduly fatigued. And that should be the time limit to perform that task. It's really important for these multiple rescue situations. Now, of course, in the real world, you've just got to get the job done, but if you've got resources, you can use that value to say, okay, well, we just send 2 helicopters to that job because you're going to have to rescue 6 people, for example. So for the water winch rescue work, we asked them to work at about 81% of their maximum capacity, and for the land task, it was about 85%. And so for water winch rescue under those physiological strain conditions, about 21 minutes is the maximum time we want to see people actively doing a rescue. And for the land-based task, it was about 13 minutes or so. And so if we anticipate at the point of sending your resources out that those tasks will be longer, then it can be factored into how many resources you deploy to the scene. Overall, what we found for this group was they had good health at baseline, but we did see some signs of early cardiovascular disease, which you would expect at that age. We're happy that putting people on a treadmill is a great surrogate for putting people in the pool just to assess non-technical capacity, so their pure fitness. So they've still got to assess their rescue swimming. The tasks are very, very demanding. Couple of little bits to finish off. We've got existing or previous assessments we used for these people, and we wanted to go and see what the strain was in the existing arbitrary made-up assessments that we'd had to this point and compare them to this scientifically validated process. Again, some scientific graphs you don't need to worry about too much, but just a quick talk through. When we went out and assessed people for a land-based task, we were asking them to walk 750 up a hill, 750 down a hill in less than 20 minutes was the kind of historical assessment that we used. And here we saw we were pushing them in the blue here, which is the old task versus the new one. So here we saw we're pushing them way up, some people above 220 beats a minute. And this one here is really important. I said to you before, normal blood lactate, 2, high level of strain, 8 to 12. We're putting people up as, and you see a row of dots here for those who are statistically minded. That's because the machine stops measuring at 25. So 25 millimoles per litre of lactate is vomit territory, can't go on, and we were pushing these people in that particular assessment too hard. So the danger there is you exclude people from doing the job that actually can do the job. And you open yourself up for a bit of a can of worms there. Because in the scientifically validated test, the strain was much less. The task duration in the old one was too long compared to the task we actually asked them to do as well. Overall, what that showed us was that the existing test was long. The simulation we created was much less. The benchmark that we measured through that bookmarking method was around about the simulation time. We were pretty happy with that. And the maximum acceptable work duration based on those calculations was about twice the recommended. So it says we should be able to rescue 2 patients without unduly exerting our staff. With the existing swim test versus the one we proposed, the existing swim test was 800 metre swim in overalls and boots and tread water. Pretty generic swim test with a 15 metre underwater swim in there as well. So pretty generic swim test. It actually was all right. It actually matched up to the scientifically validated test pretty well. The only real difference here was that the maximum acceptable work duration means you can probably rescue people in the water repeatedly based on that assessment that you'd made of your staff at that point. So our swim test we're pretty happy with, but the old walking or hiking test was a massive overshoot and may have excluded people unnecessarily. So what do we do for our staff going forward? We haven't looked at the strength components, but Pedro spoke very nicely to those components, and that's a separate body of work. And we need to know whether any of this plays into the risk of injury. But we need to set out people up to succeed in this environment. So you give them the information to meet all of these standards. It's backed by science, and if people are informed and prepared, they are much more likely to succeed. And in our service, we've got not enough staff. We're always looking to empower people to succeed. We don't want to eliminate them just for the sake of eliminating. We actually need more staff. So we want to nurture them to the standard, and we now have the information to do that. You see here, this is actually, I got a chance to go to Quebec in 2020 to a conference where there's some Canadians around, I've seen, but this is the Patrol Pathfinders for the Canadian military, and this is a document they give their staff, which is a negative time frame. So time 0 is here, and this is everything they say you need to have in the lead up. Historically, in a lot of our services, we know we say, you meet the standard, go away and meet the standard. So I think we, as a profession, we can inform our staff to be more successful using this data. Thank you for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure to come over here. I've had a great time, looking forward to the next couple of days. There's some references. There's a QR code there that links to a website where all of my publications are, and I'm happy to share any of my publications around this work, keeping in mind that it is all built in our service, so it's not directly translatable, but it may help inform your selection processes and assessment of your staff ongoing outside just the selection process, especially as your staff age and you want to keep them operational. Always happy to take an email or contact me via the website, and I'll share any of those papers with you more than happily. Once again, thank you to the team at the Rescue Swimmers Association, Ambulance Victoria, who supported my trip here, as well as the Australasian College of Paramedicine and Monash University. Thank you for your time.